Australia, 1848 to 1880, was published in 2007 and was followed closely by Madness in the Family, Insanity and Institutions in the Australian Colonial World, 1860 to 1914, published in 2010. Her most recent book, Insanity, Identity and Empire, Colonial Institutional Confinement in Australia and New Zealand, 1870 to 1910, is currently in print and due for release in October. She's also contributed more than 6 edited books and published more than 40 chapters and articles. Since coming to the University of Waikato, Cathy has developed her research and medical history with a local flavour. In 2012, Cathy assisted the Waikato Mental Health Research Group to co-edit a book on the changing face of Tukanui Psychiatric Hospital. Projects like this have helped Cathy to develop a network of relationships with local DHBs and healthcare practitioners, and she says community outreach is a vital part of her academic career. Cathy's research covers a much broader area of history than medicine and health. She has an interest in 19th century imperialism and colonialism, particularly in Australia and New Zealand. In 2012, she co-edited Law, History and Colonialism, The Reach of Empire, along with Professor Diane Kirby of La Trobe University. She also has an interest in digital history, and one of her students will be live tweeting from her inaugural lecture tonight. But for everyone else, no playing with your phones, please, during the lecture. Cathy was co-editor of Australian Historical Studies, the leading national journal of Australian history, and is currently co-editor of Health and History, a journal with a wide audience including health and medicine researchers, as well as the book series Mental Health in Historical Perspective. She served as president of the Australian and New Zealand Law and History Society and the New Zealand Historical Association. She's also, within the university, been Associate Dean, Graduate and Postgraduate for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences for 3 years. So tonight's lecture, the title is Medical Subjects, History, Health and the Present. Cathy will be looking at what and who are the subjects of medical knowledge. How did past generations of people understand illness in their own historical context? What language did they give to their symptoms, and how was it understood? She'll be exploring how social and cultural histories of medicine, health and institutions have the potential to challenge and reshape medicine in our present. Ladies and gentlemen, will you please welcome Professor Cathy Coleborne to give her inaugural professorial lecture.
E ngā rangatira o te whare wānanga o Waikato, Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Dean, tēnā koutou. E ngā manuhiri mai I te Waikato District Health Board, no mai, haere mai. Ki ngā hoa mi ngā whānau o te hapori, tēnā koutou. Ngā ahorangi, kaiako, kaimahi, tō ira katoa, e te whare wānanga. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Vice-Chancellor, Dean, special and distinguished guests, including those from the Waikato DHB, members of the Waikato Health Memorabilia Trust who are here tonight, colleagues, friends, students and family. I first want to thank the university leadership for the opportunity to the university community and the public about my research. I'd also like to use this moment before I begin to briefly thank my former and current colleagues in history over the years who've provided an innovative teaching and research context. Our several collective strengths and our excellent students continue to remind me of the value and purpose of historical study. And thanks too to my wider community of research colleagues in the faculty across a variety of disciplines and in other parts of the university, for their support, their friendship, and for affording me with many opportunities to participate in the life of the institution. And I'm also really lucky to have great research collaborators and friends in history around New Zealand and Australia and further afield, and all of those people are an important source of inspiration. A few mentors during my time here at Waikato stand out for their assistance. It's really difficult to mention everyone, but I do want to single out my former history colleagues, Peter Gibbons and Anna Green. Emeritus Professor Dick Bedford, who when he was DVC, or Deputy Vice-Chancellor Research, encouraged me to keep applying for external research funding. And Emeritus Professor Michael Selby, who a very long time ago now put me in touch with the Waikato Medical Research Foundation. And Peter Rothwell, who's here tonight, and I were just talking about that before I came in. For 5 years, I played a role as their archivist and wrote their short history, which was published in 2000. To Professor Robin Longhurst for her continual wise guidance, generosity and mentoring, especially around this evening. To my friends and family, sincere thanks to my parents, Brian and Patricia, my sister Michaela and her family, and my partner Craig and our daughter Cassidy, who I can see there. Finally, if you see someone, as the Vice-Chancellor has said, looking like she's being disruptive on a mobile device, it might be Chelsea tweeting for me, so thank you very much, Chelsea. So what and who are the subjects of medical knowledge? I use that word subjects to mean both topics and also all of us as the subjects of medical inquiry. And how did past generations of people understand illness in their own historical context? What language did they give to their symptoms? How was it understood? What I want to do here in this lecture is to take examples from the histories of health and medicine to showcase what is a vibrant and important critical field of study and its local, national and international relevance today. In particular, I will share aspects of my research in the field of histories of mental health, such as interpreting psychiatric clinical cases, stories of families and psychiatric institutions, and collaborative histories of mental illness. This account of medical subjects reminds us of the value of the medical humanities to science, technology and medicine in education and public life. And what I want to do here is to invite all of us to see medicine as inherently social, as well as to reassert the value of historical research. Now, I know this is a very broad topic, and I won't be able to cover every facet. But for me, put simply, medical humanities is a set of combined interdisciplinary approaches to medical education. What can disciplines such as history, anthropology, philosophy, or creative and performing arts add to our understandings of health and medicine? As recently noted in a new special issue of the journal Medical Humanities, the arts, humanities, and social sciences are best viewed not in service or in opposition to the clinical and life sciences, but as entangled with a biomedical culture. It's really a great pleasure for me to do this kind of research because for a very long time now, probably since the early 1990s when I was doing my master's thesis in early modern British history at the University of Melbourne, I've been really captivated by the social histories of health and medicine. It's a rich, diverse and inherently interdisciplinary field of inquiry with practitioners all over the world, and that's another part of its appeal. It also has an appeal, perhaps, because health and illness are universal subjects. We all experience illness at some stage in our lives. So making links between our present experiences of health, its systems, its modes of healing, its drug therapies, and disease itself, like those of people in the past, takes a smaller imaginative leap than we might expect. I argue that the cultures of health and medicine are best understood through our own sensibility of health. Imagine your most recent medical encounter. Perhaps you visited a general practitioner, or had a vaccination, or perhaps you took a child for a vaccination. You might have had to see a specialist or have a scan. Perhaps you advocated for a relative, an elderly person unwell. You went to a hospital and visited someone. As a sick person, you came up with language for the GP. I have a sore throat, a headache, I'm very tired. These days, and at this time of the year, you might have already checked your symptoms online and Googled symptoms of flu. Thinking about this language, your encounter with your doctor, you imagine trying to communicate how you feel in your body. And I think we all do this in the waiting room. What am I going to say? A vague, persistent ache in the knee, the type of cough you have, using language that's often imprecise. It can be difficult to express how you feel. Doctors, for their part, are trained to listen carefully and to hear your personal narrative of sickness, turning it into a clinical assessment for and treatment. My research seeks to examine the medical encounters of the past. This dialogue between patient and practitioner, sick person and healer, sufferer and physician, is the focus of most of my research in the history of mental illness. The communication between those experiencing mental illness symptoms, as defined at any given time in history and culture, is often mediated. The conversation with a physician might be prompted by a family member, the police, or a member of the community. This dialogue is complex and usually involves different players, more than one voice, and it can also be framed not only by medical ideas, but also by legal ones. Mental illness is not alone among illness conditions in this regard, for instance, notifiable diseases, but it is unusual. In 1877, this woman was taken by police to the institution known as the asylum. This image caught my eye when I was conducting research into the relationship between families, institutions, and people with mental illness in New Zealand and Australia. It's a woodcut, and it was published in the Police News, a publication in Victoria. This woman, Mrs. Anderson, was taken from Cape Schanck in coastal Victoria, near Gippsland, where I grew up, to the Hospital for the Insane in metropolitan Melbourne. Her story of madness, a word I use deliberately here as you'll see later, was told in the public domain. Once committed to the institution, she was written about and described and defined as insane in the official public record. Yet, like others arrested as insane, Mrs. Anderson did have a family who cared about her and who interceded on her behalf. The manner of her apprehension and transport to the institution looks rough and even violent to us. There were concerns even then about the physical restraints used on such people. Mental health professionals instead advocated moral treatment of the insane, work therapy, regular exposure to religious services, leisure pursuits for the well patients, and calm, beautiful surroundings. However, with large institutions of the late 19th century becoming heavily crowded with inmates with chronic conditions, there was little space or time to dedicate to their care and treatment. So the reality tended to be that the ideal asylum was only imagined, especially in the institutions in colonial Australia and New Zealand. That image became the cover of my book on the subject of families, madness, and institutions. Published in 2010, this work examined the case records of patients in 4 large public hospitals to 1910. It was the result of more than a decade of thinking about colonial histories of mental illness. It stemmed from my doctoral work, but took a significantly new approach to the topic. because in that PhD I had very tentatively looked at the concept of resistance among patients. But in the new project, some years later, I advanced the idea that the institution was not an entirely closed or forbidding place. And that's significant, I think, because the dominant story about the so-called madhouse or asylum tends to suggest that these institutions became dumping grounds, custodial places where people were simply forgotten. To some extent, this is true. Ideas about mental illness and the brain were not sufficiently worked out, just as they are contested today. Some very unwell people had become problematic in their communities, either because of their unwanted behaviours or organic disease which made them physically and mentally incapable, or because social expectations of women and men were such that the institutions were imagined as the best place for them. I condone none of these ideas, yet they need to be understood historically in time and place. In our present context, an era following the widespread closures of mental hospitals, many of them established in the 19th century, public debate about the relevance and efficacy of these institutions has highlighted the roles of families in the process of caring for those with mental illness. Many families in the present struggle with their perceived lack of help and make use of community and non-government organisations in their efforts to cope with a variety of mental health problems. My sense about the past was that many inmates had families and friends who were doing their best to engage with institutions and their modes of care. And in fact, this was supported by the evidence I located for this study, and it also aligned with arguments made by historians in other places. So I set out to look at not only patient clinical case notes, but also at other sources of evidence. These were needed to show whether family members or individual patients were able to engage in a dialogue with doctors or asylum superintendents. I used collections of family letters, visitors' books, particularly at Auckland, the institution at Auckland that I studied, registers of trial leave and absence where patients were coming and going from institutions quite regularly. I found evidence of the police tracing families for maintenance payments for institutional care. This was a concept that people would make payments, but of course not many people could afford to. And I also examined aftercare organisations that operated in some settled urban contexts by the early 20th century. And I also very carefully examined the patient cases and personal letters, for example, for evidence of a discussion about family advocacy, as well as for ideas about how people described their own symptoms or those of a family member. Given this evidence, I drew the conclusion that the institution was in fact quite permeable. Its walls allowed people both inside and outside. We think of this concept of the revolving door as a very 20th century phenomenon, but there were many people like Stephen, who at the age of 41 had multiple periods of leave of absence from Auckland Mental Hospital, as it was then known, in the early 1900s, regular visitors, many, and was both discharged and readmitted for spells of institutional care. So there was a real interplay between home and institution. I must admit, I just find this fascinating. And clinical medicine and its tools of observation really developed inside medical institutions such as mental hospitals in the late 19th century. These were quite captive populations in some respects. So people could study what was going on inside them. And so in this project, I developed a keen interest in the history of symptomatology, listing and classifying these as lay observations of mental breakdown. I don't expect you to really read what's on this slide. It's a section from an appendix in my book. And I did go through and I pulled out all of the symptoms that I saw listed by family members or noted in the case records. Of interest is the fact that the word depression was emerging in this period. It wasn't used very often. It did appear, and it appeared in medical advice books in the 1860s, but it really wasn't very common until the late 19th century. The very consistent question which drives my research in this field is how can historians make sense of the clinical case as a narrative of illness? What can patient histories tell us? How do we read and interpret them? What interested me in the project I've just described was the world revealed in the clinical pages, the comments from families, literally scribbled in the margins of the case notes, transcribed from families, the fragments of interaction and conversations between families and doctors, or the writings of those people who were themselves confined. This research found out new things about the layered and contested nature of the medical encounter and the narratives around it. In my more recent project, I turned a relatively small collection of patient case data that I've just been talking about to a very large sample of almost 4,000 cases. Now, this has presented several new challenges of interpretation, particularly for somebody who didn't really understand quantitative history when I began. I've argued here that clinical case records produced social identities for those who were institutionalised, forms of social difference, gender, class, ethnicity, sexuality were important to contemporaries. Telling the stories of individuals as opposed to the stories of groups, collective experiences, as patterned by the data collated for the study, has involved negotiating a very tense boundary between different forms of historical narrative, historical writing. And what I've really focused on here is the stories of very mobile migrants from the British Isles and Europe and some other places, and the fact that poverty led to institutionalisation not only in the hospitals for the so-called insane, but also in welfare institutions. But I was also able to follow up this interest I had in symptomatology and diagnoses, and that was great because I had a large sample of data. I could actually make some other assumptions or draw some different conclusions. And again, I don't expect you to analyse this, but it's an example of what I tried to do with diagnoses. Now, all of this work could be said to have emerged from what was then a new agenda in the social history of medicine in the mid-1980s. Historian Roy Porter wrote suggestively about medicine from below in the midst of a social history movement with so-called ordinary people's histories, all of us. This movement was driven by Marxist histories of class structures and society, and it intersected with women's and feminist history, as well as histories of colonised peoples. The examples Porter gave were from the early modern worlds of diarists, popular culture, and written remedies and popular beliefs about illness. There have been a number of historians I'm very envious of who've been really lucky to discover and use the detailed medical records of, for instance, a magical healer in 17th century England. That's one of my favourite books of all time. It's called Mystical Bedlam. The writings of a male midwife and his interaction with a local woman who delivered other women's babies in an 18th century German town. Or 20th century clinical cases from the National Women's Hospital in Melbourne. All of these historians have written really stunning books about the stories of patients, those histories from below. And they've made significant headway in medical histories of the sufferer that are instructive imagining of the relationship between healers and the sick. Sometimes we have to go outside institutions to write histories of health and illness, and we have to look at private writings. In different research, I suggest that colonial cultures of health in families and communities of care offer other insights about lay knowledge of health and disease. In a very broad chapter about health and medicine, covering the period 1840 to the end of the 20th century, that I wrote for the New Oxford History of New Zealand, I presented my view that New Zealand's history of health had to be read as one of a series of medical encounters and exchanges across cultures. For example, between Māori and Pākehā, between old world ideas and new colonial experiences, to name just two. The idea of a vocabulary of health has been the subject of a few significant pieces of scholarship in Australia and New Zealand. So how did people talk about their ordinary health experiences. Many people had lay knowledge of medical techniques and contemporary treatments, as well as harbouring their own theories and giving their own meanings to illness experiences, as we still do. And I've tried to argue too that understandings of somatic illness are critical to understanding whether there is a relationship between expressions of mental and physical illness. We see here that some of Roy Porter's findings about the cultures and the social worlds of health and healing about an earlier period of history also apply to 200 years later, with 19th century colonial Europeans growing and using medicinal herbs, and a medical marketplace populated by herbalists and many others, not just colonial doctors, most of them who were themselves migrants trained in Scotland and England, who were said at the time to be as plentiful as blackberries. Dr. Joanna Bishop, who's here tonight, who recently graduated with a PhD in history under the chief supervision of my colleague James Beattie, examined colonial practices of health and gender and domestic practices of healing as part of her thesis on the use of medicinal plants in colonial New Zealand. And my colleague James and I find many links between environmental histories and histories of health, as his own scholarship also shows. I've mentioned Joanna's work, Jo's work, to purposefully turn to teaching graduate students how to research in the social histories of health and medicine. I've just got a couple of examples here of the book covers that my students have produced work in. When they've taken my taught paper, Sickness and Health in History, students of the social history of medicine here at the university have produced a wealth of new knowledge about sickness and health in the past. And I've encouraged them to publish this work in these small booklets at honours level and master's level, and many of those students also became doctoral students in history. And they've found a wealth of possibilities in 20th century medical histories of practitioners, training and illness conditions. Student research has touched on public health, intellectual disability, mental health pathographies, and Māori mental health and illness, to name a few. The middle book cover there is Dr. John Armstrong, who in fact wrote that book before he did his doctorate in history. And he was working with the Waikato Health Memorabilia Trust, who are here tonight, and I'll talk about them in a moment. I was just chatting again with Dr. Peter Rothwell. Now, his book, written about Waikato Hospital, has sold almost 800 copies, which is pretty incredible for a work of history, and academic publishing never really reaches those heights. So John did very well with that book, showing the great interest, I think, in histories of doctors, medical practice, and so on. He went on to do his PhD, focused on medical migration and medical training using oral histories of New Zealand doctors. And my student Cheryl Ware, who's now a doctoral candidate at Macquarie University in Sydney, produced her master's thesis here in history and undertook quite innovative research examining the oral narratives of men living with HIV/AIDS after 1980. And oral history, again, is a strong feature of our teaching and research in history here at Waikato under the expert leadership of my colleague Nepia Mahuika. So together, I think we have incredible strengths in the way we come together to teach and supervise our students. How should we understand all of this research in the context of the medical humanities? At last year's Society for the Social History of Medicine conference, hosted by Oxford Brookes University in Oxford, Professor Paul Windling's opening remarks focused on a still newer agenda for the social history of medicine. Driven in part by the imperative for the humanities subjects to become more relevant, one could be forgiven for thinking the focus of his comments was shaped by outside perceptions of history as a discipline. Windling said that increasingly historians of medicine and health were charged with examinations of more recent history. Our approaches then have to involve increased scrutiny of clinical medicine, the oral testimony of health patients, standards of treatment and care, and a direct engagement with evidence-based medicine. Historians of medicine, he argued, are becoming academics with an ethical, scientific and public role, and he urged us to pursue questions of accountability in medicine as we conduct research. Windling's own research has involved questions of European medical refugees in the 20th century, such as German Jewish doctors, as well as psychiatry under the Nazi regime, and medical atrocities during the Second World War. His ideas about taking responsibility as historians of medicine are well articulated. There's a long-standing relationship and dialogue between medicine and society. They are inseparable, intertwined. Medical science derives from its social context. It's socially produced, and it's given meaning at specific times. The important and vital work of medical historians in the 1930s and again in the post-war period, such as the work of European-American historian Henry Sigarist, remind us of the value of a social awareness of disease, health and medicine from the point of view of both culture and socio-economic status. And the terms social medicine and social psychiatry were coined in the post-war period. They became hallmarks of these endeavours to connect social questions to scientific and medical praxis. And very briefly, another example of this theme lies in the teaching of medical history to medical students, which again was radicalised after the mid-1980s. Dutch historian Frank Huysman advocates teaching medical history to medical students through significant histories of bioethics in their social and cultural contexts. Talking about bioethics to medical students reminds them that science is not a value-free activity. Medical history is a thriving discipline in Europe, Britain and the US, and many of the historians I meet credit the medical humanities and the new emphasis on medical education with this strength. I'd like to move now to the role and importance of community engagement. Just like medical education, community engagement and outreach is an important part of opening up the past of medicine to scrutiny. And historians also need medical collaborators and advisors at times to adequately explain and understand the worlds of past medical techniques and practices. So these collaborations are very meaningful. And the best examples of this come in the form of funded medical history research units. Many of these exist in British and American universities and also in Australia, most notably at the University of Melbourne. Mostly, but not always, attached to universities that have medical schools. This example here is the university venture between Strathclyde and Caledonian universities in Glasgow, and it's the Centre for the Social History of Health and Healthcare. And I visited there in March this year. This research unit has a very strong focus on oral histories of health and medicine. And it's in a fantastically strong position at the moment to bid for externally funded teaching positions in the social history of medicine through the Wellcome Trust. And of course, these places have different sources of external funding, but it's a great model. It's a terrific research centre with a vibrant culture. I mentioned earlier that I wrote a very short history of the Waikato Medical Research Foundation in my first year or so in the Waikato. This role brought me into contact with local medical personnel and institutions. And in our own wider community, we now have meaningful medical history connections with the Waikato District Health Board through the Waikato Health Memorabilia Trust and Mental Health and Addictions Services. As an original trustee, my role has been, since 2004, to provide historical research advice to the Trust Board. And over the years, we've funded 6 clinical school summer studentships for history graduates. And in 2006, we established the annual Rex Wright St Clair Memorial Lecture in Medical History. I mention all of this because the work of the Trust is on display here this evening, and members of the Trust who are here tonight, Dr. Peter Rothwell, John Graham and Professor Ross Lawrenson. I want to make special mention of all of you and the collaboration between us because of all the wonderful things we've been able to do with and for our students. My students have been able to gain access to the medical history collection, photographic images, and the dispersed museum display. And it's a really inventive display, and we have to really, I think, marvel at Peter Rothwell's initiatives here. He has really driven this through the hospital so that there's, in various parts of the hospital, there are really interesting displays. They're not in one confined, small, dusty medical museum that people can only visit on Tuesday afternoon. It's actually everywhere you go through the hospital, including a 60-metre historical timeline on level 2 of the John Mead Centre. And it covers 130 years of history and contains 226 historical images. And out in the foyer out here tonight, there are some photographs, including of the original pacemaker display, which is a wonderful piece of artwork, I think, photographs of pacemakers through the ages. And usually you don't see them because they're inside people's bodies. So I think it's really interesting that the Trust didn't want to develop a central museum. It operates with this idea of a system of dispersed displays that have themes, tell stories, and they're in areas of the hospital relevant to their story and accessible to the public. So thank you to the members of the Trust here tonight. I want to return now to my own enduring interest in the history of mental health to conclude. It is where society and medicine converge, at their intersection, that we find new ways of understanding the histories of medicine and writing these, including the histories of mental health and its treatments. Writing about psychiatry and mental health in the 20th century, or near present, presents specific challenges. One of the most frequently asked questions I've had at conferences or events in the past few years is whether it's ethical to examine the past medical records of people confined inside institutions. Australian historian Professor Stephen Garton, whose work Medicine and Madness inspired me to go on in my field, and it's a landmark text in the wider discipline, has argued strongly for continued access to such records. And he says that if historians are shut off from the source, we risk not knowing enough about the past of medical treatment, institutional care and its efficacy or its problems. And histories of psychiatric treatment in the 20th century can now be written. But there are obstacles to navigate. One way forward is for collaborations between institutions, doctors, nurses, mental health care workers, service users and administrators and historians, such as the large-scale collaboration that was known for over 10 years as the Tokanui Project. People around me heard me refer to it often. This project began with the collection of the oral histories of people associated with Tokanui Hospital over time, following its closure in 1998. It became a museum exhibition at Te Awamutu Museum in 2006 called Footprints on the Land, and it grew into a large book project that took around 6 years to complete. Working with a team of writers across such disciplinary and experiential divides was the most challenging academic project I've ever completed, and possibly the most frustrating, but certainly one of the most stimulating. I'm convinced now more than ever of the importance of the view from below. The everyday, familial and professional narratives of mental illness need to be at the centre of this kind of work. So not just people who've been institutionalised, but also those who've cared for them and worked with them. We launched the book Changing Times, Changing Places in 2012, as you can see there, and it was a very significant moment. This collective history, a collaborative collective history of Tokanui and mental health services in the Waikato, has led me to a newer project to engage with the personal stories and narratives of people who were institutionalised in psychiatric institutions in the 20th century. And as part of this, I'm working with other New Zealand scholars to produce a new project around MAD histories. And MAD is a word that's been reclaimed by the international network of psychiatric survivors, service users, and others who identify with those terms used by people with mental illness. Excuse me. There is a MAD movement, a social movement to write and own the histories of psychiatric institutions. It's an interesting moment to step into that story. What then can we conclude about history, health, and the present? There's no history when we, the public, should stop questioning the power of professionals who manage our health, our education, or other aspects of social and cultural life. Training our critical gaze on the medical establishment has been a vital component of revolutionising health and medical services, of preventing errors and ethical horror, of teaching medical students how to be better and how to do no harm. We've used our feminist gaze, our deeply articulated sense of fairness and equity about class, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality, and we continue to tell medical professionals when we've found fault with care and treatment. But we also use and benefit from the results of medical experimentation. This can be a fine line to walk, but knowing how to understand medical practice and medicine in historical context is ultimately going to help us make better critical judgments about our present standards of care, as well as understanding diagnoses like depression or a range of illnesses of the body and mind in their current context. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Cathy. I'm Robert Hanna. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, and it's my pleasure to give the vote of thanks for Cathy's fascinating, well-measured and clear lecture. All of us have had occasion to go to the doctor and have medical encounters. We listen with varying degrees of comprehension to the doctor's diagnosis and come out with more or less understanding of what might be wrong with us and how we might get better. My own long-standing family doctor, now retired, knew that I was a university academic and usually opted to tell me his diagnosis with the full panoply of medical vocabulary. I don't know that he knew that I was often distracted by those words, being a classicist, wondering about their Greek or Latin roots and how they came to mean the thing that he was now describing to me. I fear I didn't attend well to the matter in hand, the diagnosis and then the prognosis of my illnesses. In her inaugural professorial lecture, Professor Coleborne has talked about how past generations of people understood illness in their own historical context, what language they gave to their symptoms and how it was understood by doctors. She explored the idea that a disease or illness is often bound by its time and place in history. She demonstrated how her research has informed her teaching, and particularly at the PhD level, and her engagement with the wider community, especially with the Waikato Health Trust. The historical context is important in an area like mental illness, which has until now been more a matter of pushing those afflicted to the outskirts of society rather than seeking to integrate them. I tend to think, coming from the south of New Zealand, of the massive pile of building called Seacliff, which some of you will know. It doesn't exist anymore, but it always fascinated me as a youngster, the scale of the building and what it said about the community that could fill it with people. And it was on very much the outskirts of Dunedin. Our language for these illnesses has changed in our own generation, to the point, as Cathy has told us, that the word mad has been reclaimed by the patient community. This idea was also explored by Cathy in an interview on Radio New Zealand just this afternoon, and I very much recommend that you go online to Radio New Zealand and listen to it. The Vice-Chancellor mentioned in his introduction that Cathy has a new book out coming out in October, entitled Insanity, Identity and Empire, Colonial Institutional Confinement in Australia and New Zealand, 1870 to 1910. In the foreword to this book, Emeritus Professor John Mackenzie talks of how Professor Coleborne has produced a strikingly original and sophisticated book that will advance significant studies in migrant, settler, and Indigenous mental health issues. The sophistication, he says, lies in her use of a web of concepts of gender, class, race, and ethnicity in specific settler colonial settings. This is high praise indeed, coming from the doyen of the history of popular and cultural imperialism. Ladies and gentlemen, we're fortunate to have a star like Professor Coleborne here at Waikato. I ask you to join me in thanking Cathy for a fascinating lecture tonight. My last duty is to advise you that the upper bar is open for mixing and mingling and for asking Cathy any specific questions if you wish to. Thank you very much indeed.